In 1981, a man named J.B. Jeyaretnam won a seat in Singapore's parliament, the first opposition member to break the ruling party's grip since independence. But just a few years later, he was bankrupted, jailed, and silenced. Why? For asking too many questions. Questions about corruption, about inequality, about power. Meanwhile, Singapore was transforming, from swamps to skyscrapers, from poverty to global wealth. But behind the success story was a system that demanded absolute control and punished those who stood in its way. Singapore's modern history begins in 1819, when it caught the eyes of Sir Stamford Raffles of the British East India Company as a strategic trading post, as it was located at the crossroads of the east-west maritime trade routes. During British rule, Singapore experienced economic growth, but remained a peripheral part of the empire. The local population, made up of Malays, Chinese migrants, Indian laborers, and a small group of Europeans, lived in ethnic enclaves with minimal integration, a social structure deliberately engineered by the colonial administration to avoid unified resistance. Despite its wealth in trade, there was very little investment in local industrial or human capital development. The situation worsened during World War II when Japanese forces occupied the island. The brutality of Japanese rule shattered the myth of Western invincibility and planted the seeds of anti-colonial sentiment that would grow stronger after the war. In 1959, Singapore achieved partial self-governance, and for the first time, the people got a chance to vote and choose their leader. They picked Lee Kuan Yew. The man was sharp, fearless, and ready to turn this struggling island into something the world had never seen. However, the independence wasn't exactly a happy ending. Singapore's economy was crumbled during the war and got played around by all the colonial powers. Lee Kuan Yew's primary goal was to unite Singapore as a part of Malaysia, as it was impossible for a country like Singapore to survive entirely on its own. Or is it? Eventually, Singapore did merge with Malaysia in 1963, but the honeymoon didn't last. Rising ethnic tensions between the Malays and the Chinese quickly turned violent, and just 2 years later, in 1965, Singapore was officially divorced from Malaysia. Lee Kuan Yew sobbed on national TV, calling it a moment of anguish. But the tears didn't last long. Within days, he and his team were in survival mode, because from that point on, Singapore was on its own, with nothing but a shaky economy, no natural resources, and enemies on every side. In its first decade, Singapore was just trying to survive. No army, no clean water, 15% unemployment. But Lee's team moved fast, striking water deals with Malaysia, secretly working with Israeli advisors to build a military, and turning the island into a magnet for foreign investment with the help of Dutch economist Albert Winsemius, who helped kickstart industrialization and bring in global corporations. In the early 1960s, the idea of turning Jurong, a mosquito-infested swamp on the western edge of Singapore, into an industrial hub sounded like madness. The British dismissed it. Local skeptics mocked it. There were no proper roads, no housing, and the ground was too soggy to support heavy construction. But Lee Kuan Yew's government saw opportunity where others saw waste. They believed that if Singapore was going to survive, it had to industrialize, and fast. At the same time, Singapore reimagined its education system from the ground up. The government shifted toward English medium education to connect Singapore to global markets and attract international investors. Schools were pushed to produce not just smart students, but technically skilled workers. Engineers, technicians, and managers who could operate machinery, adapt to new technologies, and drive industrial growth. Then came housing. In the 60s, most Singaporeans lived in overcrowded kampongs with poor sanitation and high fire risk. The government, through the newly formed Housing and Development Board, launched a massive public housing program. Secretly, it was building its national identity. This led to majority of Singaporeans becoming homeowners, but through a state-run system. This created a population that was literally invested in the country's success. It also gave the government incredible control over space, infrastructure, and social engineering. By the late 70s, Singapore's economy had transitioned from low-end manufacturing to more advanced production, including semiconductors and precision engineering. The country was no longer merely surviving, it was thriving. Wages rose, unemployment fell, and the city-state earned a global reputation for efficiency and cleanliness. Lee Kuan Yew's government saw this success as a validation of its unique governance model. Political freedom stayed tight. Opposition leaders like J.B. Jeyaretnam were often hit with defamation lawsuits that left them broke or banned from running in elections. Even foreign journalists who criticized the government were painted as threats to national unity or the economy as a whole. At the same time, the Central Provident Fund, a mandatory savings scheme, was expanded, which required citizens to channel a large portion of their income into savings for housing, health care, and retirement. This tied citizens' wealth to property, reinforcing political loyalty, but also increasing long-term economic risk. Lee Kuan Yew stepped down in 1990, which made Goh Hock Tong the senior minister. Under Goh, Singapore adopted a more consultative, slightly softer tone, though the People's Action Party still held near total control. Economically, Singapore began shifting from manufacturing to services, aiming to become a global hub for finance, biotech, logistics, and IT. It built world-class infrastructure. For example, Changi Airport, the Port of Singapore, the MRT system, and branded itself as a global city. Some controversial decisions were made in the name of progress. In the early 2000s, the government legalized casinos despite decades of moral opposition. The decision was framed as an economic necessity to boost tourism and create jobs. 2 integrated resorts, Marina Bay Sands and Resorts World Sentosa, became major revenue generators. However, gambling addiction rose sharply, and low-income Singaporeans were disproportionately affected. Another largely hidden element of this era was the growing reliance on migrant labor. Low-wage workers from Bangladesh, India, and China were brought in to build skyscrapers, clean streets, and care for the elderly. Many lived in dormitories under cramped and poor conditions. Their rights were minimal. Some faced wage theft, abuse, or were deported for speaking up. These workers built the modern Singapore skyline, but were rarely included in its success story. In 2004, Lee Hsien Loong, son of Lee Kuan Yew, became Prime Minister. His government has maintained the same core policies with minor tweaks, focusing on innovation, digitalization, and sustainability. But critiques have grown louder. Political opposition remains weak, though people are starting to speak up online. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly remain tightly restricted. LGBT+ rights lagged for decades. The Section 377A, which criminalized sex between men, remained on the books until 2022. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed some of the country's deepest inequalities. While citizens were mostly safe and well-managed, migrant workers were hit hard, with tens of thousands infected in dormitories due to overcrowded and neglected conditions. For many, this was a moment of reckoning. Singapore's development was neither accidental nor magical. It was the product of intelligent planning, bold leadership by leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, and high social discipline. Whether Singapore's model is admirable or cautionary depends on your perspective, but its journey is undeniably one of the most dramatic transformations of the 20th and 21st centuries.